The dust settled around Josephine Summers' worn boots as she stood before the land office in Elko, Nevada, staring at the notice that had just shattered her world into 1,000 pieces. The year was 1878, and the autumn sun beat down mercilessly on her shoulders as she read the words again, hoping they might somehow rearrange themselves into a different message. Her father's ranch, the Triple S, was being foreclosed in 30 days unless she could produce $3,000 or find a husband willing to assume the debt. The banker, a weasel of a man named Horace Finch, had made it abundantly clear that a woman alone had no business running cattle, and he would be pleased to see the property sold to someone more suitable. She crumpled the paper in her fist, her jaw set in a way that would have made her late father proud. Pride ran through Josephine's veins as surely as blood, inherited from a mother who had crossed the plains in a wagon train and a father who had built something from nothing with his bare hands. That same pride now threatened to be her undoing, because she would rather lose everything than go begging to the merchants and ranchers who had already made it clear they thought a 22-year-old woman had no place trying to manage 2,000 acres and a herd of longhorns. The street bustled with the usual afternoon activity. Freight wagons rumbled past, kicking up more dust. Cowboys from the surrounding ranches lounged outside the saloon, their laughter carrying on the dry wind. Josephine tucked the notice into her saddlebag and untied her mare from the hitching post, her movements stiff with suppressed emotion. She would not cry here, not where anyone could see. She had not cried when her father died 6 months ago, crushed beneath a spooked horse, and she would not cry now. Miss Summers. The voice came from behind her, deep and measured. She turned to find Preston Quinn standing a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun and eyes the color of creek water in winter. Dust coated his dark hair and the stubble on his jaw. He had been working, she could tell, probably helping with the roundup on the Double Q ranch where he served as foreman. "Mr. Quinn," she acknowledged, her voice carefully neutral. They had spoken perhaps a dozen times in the year since he had arrived in Elko from Montana, always with perfect propriety, always with an edge of something unspoken hanging in the air between them. He shifted his weight, turning his hat in his hands. "I could not help but notice you came from the land office. I hope there is no trouble." Josephine's spine stiffened. The last thing she needed was pity from Preston Quinn or anyone else. "Nothing that concerns you. Maybe it does." He took a step closer and she caught the scent of leather and sage. "Word travels in a town this size. I heard Finch has been making noise about the Triple S." Heat flooded her cheeks, part anger and part humiliation. "Then you have heard wrong. My ranch is my own business." "I did not mean to offend." His voice remained steady, patient. "I have some money saved. If you need help meeting an obligation, I would be honored to offer a loan." The kindness in his offer only made her anger burn hotter. "I do not need charity, Mr. Quinn. I am perfectly capable of handling my affairs." Something flickered in his eyes, there and gone too quickly to name. He settled his hat back on his head with a nod. "Of course. My apologies for presuming otherwise." He walked past her toward his own horse, a rangy bay gelding tied further down the rail. Josephine swung into her saddle, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered the reins. She had just refused help from one of the few men in the territory who might have offered it without expecting something ugly in return. Pride, her father used to say, was both her greatest strength and her most dangerous weakness. The ride back to the Triple S took an hour, long enough for Josephine to rehearse and discard a dozen impossible plans. She could try to drive a herd to California before the deadline, but Roundup was not complete, and she was short 3 hands who had quit the moment they realized a woman would be paying their wages. She could sell off parcels of land, but not quickly enough or for anywhere near what they were worth. She could write to her aunt in St. Louis, but the woman had made her opinions clear when Josephine had refused to come east after her father's death. The ranch house came into view as she crested the final rise, a sturdy structure of timber and stone that her father had built to last generations. Corrals spread out to the east, most of them empty now. The barn needed a new roof. The bunkhouse where she had once heard the hands playing cards and singing stood silent. She had 2 men left, old Charlie, who was too loyal to leave, and his nephew Thomas, who was too young to know better. She unsaddled her mare and turned her into the corral, then stood for a long moment staring at the mountains that rose purple and imposing to the west. Somewhere out there was the future her father had imagined for her, one where the Triple S thrived and grew. Somewhere out there was also the reality she now faced, where hard work and determination were not enough when the world refused to see past her gender. The sound of hoofbeats pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Preston Quinn riding up the long drive, his bay moving at an easy lope. Her first instinct was to tell him to leave, but something in the set of his shoulders made her wait. He dismounted and walked toward her, stopping at a distance that was close enough for conversation but far enough to be proper. "I am going to speak plainly, Miss Summers, because I believe you are the kind of woman who appreciates plain speaking. I already told you I do not need your money. I am not offering money." He met her eyes directly, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. "I am offering my name." The words hung between them, absurd and impossible. "Excuse me, marry me." He said it the way another man might discuss the weather. "The bank will accept a husband's guarantee on your father's debt. I have enough saved to make the payments while we rebuild the herd. In return, I would become a partner in the Triple S." Josephine felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "You cannot be serious." "I am entirely serious." He took a step closer. "I know this is not the proposal a woman dreams of. There is no poetry in it, no romance. But it is a solution that benefits us both. You keep your ranch. I gain a stake in land I could never afford to buy outright. You want to marry me for my land." The words came out sharper than she intended. "I want to marry you because I respect what you are trying to do here." His voice remained calm, measured. "I have watched you work, Miss Summers. I have seen you doctor sick cattle and mend fence and break horses that would give most men pause. You deserve the chance to prove what you can do, and I can give you that chance." She turned away from him, her mind racing. It was a business proposition, nothing more. No different than dozens of arrangements made across the West, where practical considerations outweighed romantic notions. But the idea of marrying a man she barely knew, of tying her fate to his for the sake of convenience, made something in her chest tighten with resistance. "Why would you do this?" she asked, still facing away. "You could work another few years, save enough to buy your own place. Why risk everything on a ranch that might fail anyway?" "Because I believe it will not fail." She heard him move closer, his boots crunching on the dry earth. "And because I think you and I could build something worthwhile together, even if it starts from practicality rather than passion." Josephine closed her eyes. Pride screamed at her to refuse, to find another way, any other way. But beneath the pride was a cold current of pragmatism she had inherited from her father along with his stubbornness. The Triple S was more than land and cattle. It was her father's legacy, her mother's dreams, her own blood and sweat poured into every acre. Could she really let it go rather than accept help, even help that came with strings attached? She turned to face him. "If I agreed to this, what would you expect from the arrangement?" your name on a marriage certificate, a partnership in running the ranch, eventually, respect and friendship if we are fortunate enough to build them." He paused, and something in his expression softened. "I would not demand rights you were not ready to give, Miss Summers. This would be a marriage of convenience unless and until we both wished it to be something more. You would give up the possibility of marrying for love." "I watched my parents marry for love," he said quietly. "They were dead within 5 years, my mother from childbirth and my father from grief. Love is no guarantee of happiness, but respect and shared purpose can build something that lasts." There was pain in his words, old and buried deep. Josephine found herself studying him with new eyes, seeing past the capable foreman to the man who had learned hard lessons young. He was offering her a way forward, and he was doing it without pity or condescension. The question was whether she could swallow her pride enough to accept. "I need to think about this," she said finally. He nodded, unsurprised. "Of course. But Finch gave you 30 days. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to make the arrangements." "Come back tomorrow," she told him. "I will have an answer for you then." He settled his hat, then paused. "For what it is worth, Miss Summers, I think your father would be proud of how hard you have fought, whatever you decide." He mounted his horse and rode back down the drive, leaving Josephine alone with the weight of an impossible choice. She walked to the house, her footsteps echoing on the porch boards. Inside, everything was exactly as her father had left it. His pipe still sat on the mantel. His journal, filled with careful notes about the ranch, lay on the desk. She picked it up and flipped through the pages, reading his hopes and plans in faded ink. That night, she lay awake in her childhood bed, staring at the ceiling. The house creaked around her, familiar sounds that usually brought comfort. Tonight they felt like the groans of something dying. By dawn, she had made her decision. Preston arrived mid-morning, riding up as she was working with a young stallion in the round pen. She let the horse loose and climbed over the fence, dusting off her hands. He dismounted and waited, his face carefully neutral. "I have conditions," she said without preamble. Something that might have been relief flickered across his features. "Name them." "The ranch remains the Triple S. I will not change the brand or the name." "Agreed. All major decisions about the operation are made together. You do not override me simply because you are a man." "Agreed. If this arrangement is not working after a year, we dissolve the marriage and split the assets fairly." He was quiet for a moment, considering. "What if it is working? Then we renegotiate terms." She held his gaze. "I will not be trapped in something that makes us both miserable." "Fair enough." He extended his hand. "Do we have an agreement, Miss Summers?" She looked at his hand, calloused and scarred from years of ranch work. This was the moment. Once she shook his hand, there would be no going back. She would be Josephine Quinn, wife of Preston Quinn, bound by law and circumstance to a man she barely knew. She took his hand. His grip was firm, warm, and steadier than her own. "We have an agreement, Mr. Quinn." "Preston," he corrected. "If we are to be married, you should use my given name." "Preston," she repeated, testing the shape of it. "You should call me Josephine, Josephine." The way he said it, slow and deliberate, made it sound like something more than just a name. They made the arrangements quickly and without fanfare. The preacher in Elko was accustomed to hasty weddings and asked no uncomfortable questions. They needed 2 witnesses, and Preston brought his employer, James Douglas of the Double Q, while Josephine asked old Charlie to stand up with her. The ceremony took less than 10 minutes, performed in the preacher's parlor with his wife playing a slightly off-key hymn on the piano. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Preston leaned down and pressed a chaste kiss to Josephine's cheek. His lips were warm, his breath stirring her hair. She felt her heart hammer against her ribs, though whether from nerves or something else she could not say. They went directly to the bank afterward. Horace Finch's expression when they walked in together was worth every moment of awkwardness in the preacher's parlor. His smile turned oily as Preston laid out the marriage certificate and a bank draft for the first payment on the debt. "Well," Finch said, his voice dripping false congratulations, "this is unexpected. I had not realized you and Miss Summers, pardon me, Mrs. Quinn, were courting." "My wife prefers to keep private matters private," Preston said, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. They left the bank as husband and wife, the fate of the Triple S secured for at least another few months. James Douglas clapped Preston on the shoulder and invited them to dinner at the big house, but Josephine pleaded exhaustion and Preston politely declined. They rode back to the ranch in silence, the reality of what they had done settling over them like dust. At the ranch, Preston unsaddled both horses while Josephine stood uncertainly in the yard. This was her home, but now it was his too. The thought felt foreign, invasive. She had lived here alone for 6 months, answering to no one, organizing her days as she saw fit. Now there would be another person to consider, another presence in her space. "I will move my things into the bunkhouse," Preston said, leading the horses toward the corral. "Give us both time to adjust before we make any changes to the living arrangements." Relief and something that might have been disappointment warred in her chest. "That seems sensible." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Josephine, I meant what I said. This marriage does not obligate you to anything you are not comfortable with. We will take this as slowly as you need." "And if I am never comfortable?" The question came out more vulnerable than she intended. "Then we will be business partners who happen to share a name." He said it simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I did not do this to trap you. I did it because I believe in what you are trying to build here." She nodded, not trusting her voice. He collected his things from his horse and headed toward the bunkhouse, leaving her alone in the deepening twilight. She went into the house and closed the door, then leaned against it, wondering what exactly she had gotten herself into. The first weeks of their arrangement passed in a blur of hard work. Preston rose before dawn and worked until well after dark, throwing himself into the ranch with a dedication that surprised even Josephine. He repaired the barn roof, mended miles of fence, and helped her complete the roundup with an efficiency that made her realize how desperately she had needed another experienced hand. They developed a rhythm, working side by side during the day and retreating to their separate spaces at night. Preston took his meals with old Charlie and Thomas in the bunkhouse, though Josephine sometimes caught him glancing toward the main house with an expression she could not quite read. One evening, 3 weeks into their marriage, she made a large pot of stew and walked it over to the bunkhouse. The men looked up in surprise when she knocked and entered. "I made too much," she said, which was a transparent lie. "Seemed wasteful to let it go to the dogs." Preston stood and took the pot from her, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. "That is kind of you. Would you like to join us?" She hesitated, then nodded. They made room for her at the rough table, and she sat down among the men who worked her land. Old Charlie told stories about her father's early days in Nevada, and Thomas shared gossip from town. Preston was quieter, but his presence was steady and grounding. When he did speak, the others listened. She found herself watching him when she thought he was not paying attention. The way his hands moved with confidence and precision. The rare smile that transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. The patience he showed with the green horses and the younger cowboys. He was, she realized, exactly the kind of man her father would have wanted running the Triple S. That realization brought its own complications. A month into their marriage, trouble arrived in the form of cattle thieves. Josephine woke to Preston pounding on the door of the main house well before dawn, his face grim in the lamplight. "Someone cut the fence on the north pasture," he said without preamble. "Looks like they took at least 50 head." She was dressed and armed within minutes, riding out with Preston and the other men to assess the damage. The cut fence was clean, professional. The tracks led northeast toward the mountains, already starting to fade in the pre-dawn wind. "We need to notify the sheriff," old Charlie said, but Josephine was already shaking her head. "By the time we ride to town and back, the trail will be cold. We go now." Preston studied her for a long moment. "This could be dangerous. These men are professionals. This is my cattle." She met his eyes, daring him to argue. "I am going." She saw him make a decision. "Then we go together. Charlie, you and Thomas stay here and watch the rest of the herd. We will be back by nightfall." They tracked the stolen cattle through the rough country northeast of the ranch, following signs that Preston read as easily as words on a page. He pointed out broken branches, disturbed earth, the direction of the tracks. Josephine had tracked before, but watching him work was like seeing an artist paint. By noon, they had closed the distance enough to hear the cattle before they saw them. Preston dismounted and moved forward on foot, motioning for Josephine to follow. They crept to the edge of a rocky outcropping and looked down into a narrow canyon. Below, 3 men were rebranding her cattle with practiced efficiency. A fire burned hot, heating the irons. The stolen longhorns milled nervously in a makeshift pen. One of the thieves was young, barely out of his teens. The other 2 were older, harder, with the look of men who had been breaking laws for a long time. 3 against 2, Preston murmured, "and they have the advantage of position. So what do we do?" He thought for a moment, his eyes scanning the canyon. "There is a game trail that leads down behind them. If we can get close enough, we might be able to get the drop on them without anyone getting shot." "Might," he turned to look at her, his expression serious. "I will not lie to you. This is risky. If you want to go back and get the sheriff, I will not think less of you." She checked her rifle, making sure it was loaded. "These are my cattle. We do this together." Something that looked like pride flickered across his face. "Stay behind me and do not shoot unless I give the word." They worked their way down the game trail, moving with the patience of hunters. The sound of the cattle and the thieves' voices covered their approach. Preston positioned them behind a tumble of boulders 20 yards from the fire. "You boys are working cattle that do not belong to you," Preston called out, his rifle trained on the oldest of the 3 men. "Put down your irons and step away from the herd." The thieves spun around, reaching for their guns. Josephine brought her rifle up, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her chest. "I would not," Preston said calmly. "My wife is an excellent shot, and she is considerably more angry than I am." The youngest thief looked like he wanted to run. The oldest, a man with a scar across his cheek, assessed the situation with cold eyes. "You are making a mistake, friend. This is none of your concern." "It is very much my concern," Josephine said, her voice steady despite the fear making her hands shake. "Those cattle wear my brand. You are thieves and you are going to return what you stole." The scarred man's eyes narrowed. "The woman from the Triple S heard you were running things now. Heard wrong looks like." "You heard right," Preston said. "She runs the ranch, I just help. Now put down your guns before someone does something stupid." For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then the youngest thief carefully unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall. The middle one followed suit. The scarred man held out longest, his jaw working, before finally doing the same. "Smart," Preston said. He moved forward, keeping his rifle trained on them while Josephine gathered their weapons. Now you are going to help us drive these cattle back to the Triple S, and then you are going to have a conversation with the sheriff." They spent the rest of the day driving the stolen herd back across the rough country. By the time they reached the ranch, twilight was painting the sky purple and gold. Old Charlie and Thomas helped pen the cattle while Preston kept watch over the thieves. Josephine rode for the sheriff, returning an hour later with a tired-looking lawman who took the thieves into custody with a minimum of fuss. When it was finally over, when the sheriff and his prisoners had ridden away and the recovered cattle were secured in the corral, Josephine found herself standing in the barn, shaking with delayed reaction. Preston found her there, sitting on a hay bale with her head in her hands. "Josephine." He sat down beside her, not touching but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. "It is over. You are safe. I could have gotten you killed." The words came out choked. "Going after them like that, it was reckless and foolish, and I could have gotten you killed. But you did not." His voice was gentle. "You stood your ground and you got your cattle back. Your father would have been proud." She looked up at him, her vision blurry with unshed tears. "Why did you come with me? You could have refused, insisted we go for the sheriff." "Because you asked me to be your partner," he said simply. "Partners stand together, even when things get dangerous." Something broke open in her chest, some wall she had been holding in place through sheer force of will. She turned toward him, and he was there, solid and real, his arms coming around her in an embrace that felt like coming home. She pressed her face against his chest and finally let herself shake, let herself feel the fear and the relief and the gratitude. He held her until the shaking stopped, one hand stroking her hair with a tenderness that made her throat tight. When she finally pulled back, his shirt was damp with her tears. "I am sorry," she said. "That was not very professional, Josephine." He tilted her chin up with gentle fingers until she met his eyes. "We are not just business partners anymore. I do not know exactly what we are, but we crossed some line today. You have to know that." Her breath caught. His face was close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, the shadow of his beard, the scar that cut through his left eyebrow. She realized with a jolt that she wanted to kiss him, wanted it with a fierceness that startled her. "What do you want us to be?" she whispered. "I want us to be whatever feels right." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "No obligations, no expectations, just honest about what we feel." "And what do you feel?" "I feel like the luckiest man in Nevada." He said it with such sincerity that she could not doubt him. "I feel like I want to kiss my wife if she is willing." In answer, she closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, exploring, but it deepened quickly into something hungry and desperate. His hand cupped the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. She gripped the front of his shirt, pulling him closer, wanting to erase every inch of space between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "We should probably take this slowly." "Probably," she agreed, already leaning in for another kiss. They made it to the house eventually, stumbling through the door wrapped around each other. Preston kept trying to pull back, to give her space to change her mind, but she was done with space. She had spent 6 months alone, and before that a lifetime being told she was too stubborn, too independent, too much of everything. Here was a man who met her stubbornness with steady patience, who saw her independence as strength, who seemed to think she was exactly enough. She led him to her room, to her bed, and discovered that the practical arrangement they had made could transform into something neither practical nor simple. His touch was reverent, patient, waiting always for her signal before moving forward. She had expected awkwardness, given that neither of them had spoken of previous experience, but what she found instead was a deep, instinctive understanding of how they fit together. Afterward, lying in the tangle of quilts with his arm around her and her head on his chest, she felt something slot into place that had been crooked since her father died. Maybe since before that. Preston's fingers traced idle patterns on her shoulder, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. "None." She tilted her head to look up at him. "You, not a single one." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Though I should probably move my things from the bunkhouse tomorrow, the men will talk otherwise." She laughed, the sound surprising her. When had she last laughed like that, free and genuine? "Let them talk. Everyone in town already thinks we married in haste for scandalous reasons. Did we not?" His tone was teasing, lighter than she had ever heard it. "I suppose we did, just not the scandal they imagine." They fell asleep tangled together, and when Josephine woke in the gray light before dawn, she found Preston already awake, watching her with an expression so tender it made her chest ache. "Good morning, wife," he said softly. "Good morning, husband," she replied, and kissed him to seal the truth of it. The months that followed were the hardest and best of Josephine's life. Winter came early that year, bringing snow that blanketed the ranch and turned daily chores into battles against the cold. But with Preston at her side, the work felt less overwhelming. He had moved into the main house, bringing little with him beyond clothes and a few books. They fell into routines that felt both new and ancient, like rediscovering something they had always known. They worked side by side during the short winter days, feeding cattle and breaking ice on water troughs. At night, they huddled close to the fire, reviewing accounts and making plans for spring. Preston taught her card games his mother had taught him. She read aloud from her father's favorite books. They made love with increasing confidence and creativity, learning each other's bodies the way they had learned to work together on the ranch. The town gossip eventually shifted from speculation about their hasty marriage to grudging acceptance. When they attended church on Sundays, sitting together in a pew, no one commented on how her hand was clasped in his or how he helped her into the wagon with tender care. They were simply the Quinns of the Triple S, one of dozens of ranch couples working to survive in the harsh Nevada territory. But Josephine knew they were more than that. She saw it in the way Preston looked at her across the dinner table, like she was something precious. She felt it in the way he always asked her opinion, even when he clearly already had a plan. He never once tried to take over, never suggested that his way was better simply because he was a man. They were truly partners, in every sense of the word. Spring arrived with a rush of snowmelt and new grass, and with it came the hard work of calving season. For 6 weeks they barely slept, taking turns checking the herd every few hours. Josephine lost track of how many times she woke to find Preston already gone, out in the cold night delivering a breech calf or defending a newborn from predators. One night in late April, she found him in the barn with a struggling heifer who was too small for the calf she carried. He looked up when Josephine entered, his face etched with exhaustion and worry. "She is too narrow," he said. "I may have to choose between saving the cow or the calf." Josephine knelt beside him, assessing the situation. The heifer was one of her father's last purchases, bought from good stock. She was valuable, but so was the calf. "Do what you have to do." For the next hour they worked together in tense silence. Preston's hands were steady and sure as he manipulated the calf into a better position. Josephine talked softly to the heifer, keeping her as calm as possible. When the calf finally slid free, slick and gasping, they both sat back in relief. "Both alive," Preston said, wonder in his voice. Against considerable odds. The heifer began licking her calf, maternal instinct overriding her exhaustion. Josephine felt tears prick her eyes, though whether from relief or tiredness she could not say. Preston noticed and pulled her close. "What is wrong?" "Nothing." She leaned into him, letting herself take comfort in his strength. "Everything is so much better with you here. I do not know how I was managing before. You would have found a way." He kissed the top of her head. "You always find a way, but I am grateful you do not have to anymore." By the time calving season ended, they had 100 healthy calves and a herd that had grown strong on spring grass. The ranch accounts were no longer quite so dire. They were not rich by any means, but they were surviving, even starting to thrive. One evening in May, Josephine was going over the books when she realized something that made her pen still on the page. Preston looked up from the saddle he was mending. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong." She set down her pen carefully. "I just realized that as of today, we have been married for 6 months. He set aside the saddle and came to stand behind her chair, his hands resting on her shoulders. "So we have. Does that mean we need to renegotiate our arrangement?" She tilted her head back to look up at him. "I think it does." Something that might have been worry flickered across his face. "What terms would you like to propose?" "I want to make this real," she said. "Not a business arrangement or a marriage of convenience. I want this to be a true marriage, Preston, because I love you." The words hung in the air between them. She had not meant to say it quite so baldly, but there it was, the truth she had been dancing around for weeks. His hands tightened on her shoulders. "Josephine, you do not have to say it back," she said quickly. "I know this started as something practical, and if that is all you want, I can accept that. But I needed you to know how I feel." He pulled her up out of the chair and into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "I love you," he said fiercely against her hair. "I have loved you since the day you stood outside the land office looking like you wanted to fight the world with your bare hands. I have loved you through every stubborn, prideful, magnificent moment since then." She pulled back enough to see his face, to confirm what his words promised. His eyes were bright with emotion, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "Why did you not say anything?" she asked. "Because I did not want you to feel obligated. I married you to give you a choice, not to trap you." He cupped her face in his calloused hands. "I wanted you to come to me freely if you came at all. I am here," she said, "freely and completely. I am yours, Preston Quinn. And I am yours, Josephine Quinn." They sealed the promise with a kiss that turned into more, and that night they made love with a new understanding between them. This was not convenience or practicality. This was devotion, pure and simple. Summer came on strong and hot, turning the range island golden. They hired 2 more hands, men Preston had worked with in Montana, who were willing to work for a woman boss. The Triple S began to look prosperous again, the corrals full and the buildings in good repair. In July, they drove a herd to the railroad in Reno, a week-long trip that tested both cattle and handlers. Josephine rode alongside Preston, matching him mile for mile, proving to anyone who watched that she was as capable as any man on the trail. When they sold the herd for a price that finally cleared her father's debt entirely, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten what freedom felt like. They celebrated that night in a Reno hotel, dining on steak and champagne. In their room afterward, Josephine stood by the window looking out at the city lights. "We did it," she said softly. "The ranch is really ours now, free and clear." Preston came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You did it. I just helped." "No," she turned in his arms. "We did it together. That is what makes this work, Preston. We are stronger together than either of us could be alone." He nodded, his expression serious. "I have been thinking about the future, about what we want to build." "And what do you want to build?" "A legacy." He said it simply. "Not just a successful ranch, but something that lasts. Children to pass it on to. A family." Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. They had never discussed children, though given the nature of their marriage it was not exactly a surprising topic. How many children? As many as we are blessed with. He smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his face. Though I confess, the idea of a daughter who looks like you and has your stubborn streak both delights and terrifies me. She laughed and pulled him toward the bed. Then we had better start working on making this family of yours. They returned to the Triple S a week later to news that made Josephine's blood run cold. Old Charlie met them at the gate, his weathered face grim. There has been trouble, Mrs. Quinn. Some of the ranchers are forming an association. They are saying women should not be running cattle operations. They are trying to force you out. Preston's jaw went tight, but he remained calm. Which ranchers? Thompson, Aldridge, and Frank Carlson from the Circle C. Charlie spat in the dust. Carlson is the ringleader. Says it is not proper for a woman to be in a man's business. Josephine felt old anger kindle in her chest. Frank Carlson has been trying to buy the Triple S since before my father died. This has nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with him wanting my land. What do they plan to do? Preston asked. They are pressuring the other ranchers to refuse to do business with you. No shared roundups, no grazing agreements, nothing. They figure if they isolate you enough, you will sell. Josephine looked at Preston, seeing her own anger reflected in his face. We will not sell. No, he agreed. We will not. But we need to be smart about this. He turned to Charlie. Is anyone standing with us? James Douglas of the Double Q refused to join the association. Said any man who would not do business with a woman as capable as Mrs. Quinn was a fool. Charlie's expression brightened slightly. A few of the smaller outfits are staying neutral. Then we reach out to them, Josephine decided. We make alliances where we can, and we prove that we can run this ranch as well as any man. The next weeks were tense. Twice, they found fences cut and cattle scattered. Once, someone took shots at Preston while he was riding the North Range, though whether they meant to kill or just intimidate was unclear. Josephine wanted to ride straight to Frank Carlson's ranch and confront him, but Preston convinced her that was exactly what Carlson wanted. He is trying to make you lose your temper, to do something that will justify his campaign against you, Preston explained. We need to stay calm and keep doing good work. Let the quality of our operation speak for itself. It was hard advice to follow when she wanted to fight, but Preston was right and she knew it, so they kept their heads down and focused on the ranch. They helped James Douglas with his roundup, even though he insisted they did not owe him. They loaned equipment to smaller ranchers who had stayed neutral. They made themselves indispensable to the community in ways that had nothing to do with gender. By autumn, the tide had begun to turn. The association Frank Carlson had tried to build never gained the traction he wanted. Too many ranchers remembered favors the Triple S had done, or respected the quality of their cattle, or simply thought the whole business was ridiculous. When Carlson tried to pressure the bank to call in loans on ranches that did business with Josephine, Horace Finch, of all people, refused. Whatever my personal opinions, Finch told Carlson in front of half the town, Mrs. Quinn has never missed a payment. Her accounts are in order and her collateral is sound. I will not be pressured into unprofessional behavior. Josephine almost felt grateful to the Weasley banker, though it helped that Preston had made a point of keeping their accounts impeccable and their dealings above reproach. The final confrontation came in October at the fall auction in Elko. Josephine and Preston brought their best steers, animals they had spent months preparing. Frank Carlson was there with cattle from the Circle C, as were most of the other major ranchers in the territory. When the Triple S steers came up for bid, there was a moment of tense silence. Josephine held her breath, waiting to see if Carlson's influence would suppress the bidding. Then James Douglas raised his hand, starting the bidding strong. Another rancher joined in. Then another. By the time the gavel fell, the Triple S steers had sold for top dollar, the highest price of the day. Frank Carlson's face was purple with rage. He pushed through the crowd toward Josephine, his fists clenched. Preston stepped between them, his expression calm but his body language clearly protective. "You want to say something to my wife, Carlson. You say it through me," Preston said quietly. "Your wife has no business running cattle," Carlson spat. "It is not natural. It is not right." "What is not right," Josephine said, stepping around Preston, "is a man who tries to destroy someone's livelihood because he cannot buy it cheaply. You wanted my land, Mr. Carlson. You thought you could wait me out or force me out. You were wrong." "This is not over," Carlson said, but his voice lacked conviction. Around them, the crowd was watching with expressions ranging from disapproval to disgust. He had lost, and everyone knew it. "Yes," Josephine said firmly. "It is." Carlson pushed past them and out of the auction house. Preston turned to her, a question in his eyes. She nodded, letting him know she was all right. Then James Douglas was there, clapping Preston on the back and congratulating them both on their fine steers and finer nerve. That night, riding home under a sky brilliant with stars, Josephine felt something settle in her chest. Peace, she realized. For the first time since her father died, she felt truly at peace. "What are you thinking about?" Preston asked, his horse keeping pace beside hers. "I am thinking about how much has changed in a year," she said. "Last October I was alone and drowning. Now I have you and the ranch is thriving, and I just publicly defeated a man who tried to destroy me." "You are extraordinary," Preston said. "I hope you know that." She looked over at him, this man who had offered his name and his future when she was too proud to ask. "We are extraordinary together." "Yes," he agreed. "We are." Winter came again, the second winter of their marriage. This time Josephine faced it not with dread but with anticipation. The ranch was secure, their enemies defeated, their love proven through trial after trial. They spent long evenings by the fire, making plans for the spring. It was during one of those evenings in January that Josephine realized her monthly courses were late. She said nothing at first, not wanting to raise hopes prematurely. But when another week passed with no change, she could not keep the secret any longer. She waited until they were alone in their bedroom, Preston reading by lamplight while she brushed her hair. "I think I might be carrying your child." He looked up slowly, the book forgotten in his lap. "You think?" "I am fairly certain. I wanted to wait to tell you until I was sure, but I cannot keep it to myself." She set down her brush. "Are you pleased?" He was across the room in 2 strides, pulling her into his arms. "Pleased does not begin to cover it." His voice was rough with emotion. "You are giving me everything, Josephine. The ranch, a family, a future I never dared to imagine." She held him tight, feeling the truth of his words reflected in her own heart. "We are giving each other everything." The pregnancy was confirmed a few weeks later by a doctor in Elko. Josephine continued working through the spring, though Preston became increasingly protective as her condition became obvious. She tolerated his hovering because she knew it came from love, though she drew the line when he suggested she stop riding. "I will ride until the day before this baby comes," she informed him. "Women have been having babies and working ranches since time began. I am not made of glass." He held up his hands in surrender, though she caught him watching her with worried eyes whenever she climbed into a saddle. Their son was born in late August, delivered in their bedroom with the help of a midwife and old Charlie's wife, who had delivered half the babies in the territory. The labor was long and hard, but Josephine endured it with the same stubborn strength she brought to everything else. When the midwife finally placed the squalling infant in her arms, She looked down at his red face and shock of dark hair and fell completely, irrevocably in love. Preston, who had spent the labor pacing holes in the parlor floor, came in looking pale and terrified. When he saw Josephine holding their son, his expression transformed into something almost painful in its intensity. "A boy," the midwife announced unnecessarily. "Strong and healthy." Preston sat carefully on the edge of the bed, reaching out one tentative finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. Their son gripped it with surprising strength, and Preston made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "He is perfect," Preston whispered. "You are perfect. I do not have words for what I feel right now." "Neither do I," Josephine admitted. She was exhausted and sore and happier than she had ever been in her life. What should we call him? They had discussed names but never settled on anything definite. Preston studied their son's face thoughtfully. "Samuel, after your father, if you agree." Tears sprang to her eyes. "Samuel Quinn." "Papa would have loved that." "Samuel James Quinn," Preston amended. "After your father and mine." They sat together as the sun set beyond the window, their son sleeping peacefully between them, and Josephine thought about all the impossible twists that had led to this moment. If she had not been too proud to beg for help, if Preston had not been bold enough to offer an impossible solution, none of this would exist. Not the saved ranch, not the love that had grown between them, not this perfect child who represented their future. The years that followed were full and rich. Samuel grew into a sturdy boy with his father's steady temperament and his mother's determination. When he was 3, Josephine gave birth to twin daughters, Mary and Grace, who kept the entire household in chaos with their energy and mischief. 2 years after that came another son, Daniel, who was quiet and thoughtful from the start. The Triple S continued to prosper under their joint leadership. They expanded the herd, improved the bloodlines, and became known throughout Nevada for producing top-quality cattle. Preston's instincts and Josephine's business sense proved to be a formidable combination. Other women ranchers began to emerge, inspired by Josephine's example, and she made it a point to support them however she could. Frank Carlson lost the Circle C in a poker game and left Nevada in disgrace. His land was bought by a consortium that included the Triple S, the Double Q, and several smaller ranches working together. James Douglas became not just an ally but a true friend, a regular presence at Sunday dinners and holiday celebrations. Old Charlie retired to a small house on the edge of the property, where he spent his days teaching Samuel and the other children about horses and cattle and the ways of the land. Thomas became foreman when Preston's responsibilities expanded to managing not just the Triple S, but consulting for other operations. They added a schoolhouse on the property and hired a teacher so the children would not have to ride hours to town for education. On their 10th anniversary, Preston surprised Josephine by taking her back to the hotel in Reno, where they had celebrated clearing her father's debt. They had not had time alone together in months, and Josephine had forgotten what it felt like to have his full attention without interruption. Over dinner, he pulled a small box from his pocket and slid it across the table. Inside was a ring set with a modest but beautiful diamond. "I never gave you a proper engagement ring," he said. "I wanted to fix that." She slipped it on, admiring how it caught the light. "You have given me so much more than a ring, Preston. You have given me partnership and respect and a love I never thought I would find. You gave me a reason to believe the future could be better than the past." He took her hand across the table. "You gave me a home, Josephine. Not just the ranch, but a place to belong. I was drifting before I found you. Now I am anchored." They went back to their room and made love with the passion and familiarity of a decade together, relearning each other's bodies, reconnecting in the way of couples who had been apart too long. Afterward, lying in the comfortable tangle they always ended up in, Josephine reflected on how far they had come. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "The way we started, the bargain we made, not for a single second." He was quiet for a moment. "Though I confess, I did not make that offer purely out of respect for your situation." She propped herself up on an elbow to look at him. "What do you mean?" "I was already halfway in love with you," he admitted. "I had been watching you for months, admiring your spirit and your determination. When I heard about the foreclosure, I saw an opportunity to make myself necessary to you. It was not entirely altruistic." "Preston Quinn," she said in mock outrage. "You manipulated me into marrying you." "I offered you an option you were free to refuse," he corrected. "Though I confess I very much hoped you would not refuse." She kissed him long and deep. "I am glad you were so devious, otherwise I might have lost everything." "You would have found a way," he said with certainty. "You always do, but I am grateful I got to be part of the solution." They returned to the ranch the next day to find that the twins had somehow gotten into the hayloft and could not get down. Samuel had lost his favorite horse, and Daniel had given himself a black eye running into a fence post. Normal life resumed with all its chaos and joy. More years passed. Samuel grew into a fine young man who loved the ranch as deeply as his parents did. The twins were inseparable, always getting into trouble together and getting out of it with matching innocent smiles. Daniel discovered a talent for numbers and took over managing the books, freeing Josephine to focus on other aspects of the operation. When Josephine was 40, she gave birth to one last child, a daughter they named Lily. She came as a surprise, born a full decade after Daniel, and she was spoiled rotten by her older siblings. Preston, who had gone gray at the temples and gained a few lines around his eyes, treated his youngest daughter like precious glass until Josephine told him firmly to stop. "She is going to have to learn to be tough," Josephine said, watching 5-year-old Lily attempt to climb onto a horse twice her size. "The world is not kind to women even now. We have to teach her to stand up for herself." "I know," Preston sighed, "but she is so small. So was I once. And I survived." She leaned against him, comfortable in the way of long-time couples. "She has both of us to teach her. She will be fine." And Lily was fine. She grew into a fierce, independent girl who could outride her brothers and outthink everyone. She had her mother's stubborn streak and her father's steady patience, a combination that served her well. Samuel married at 24, bringing home a sweet-tempered woman from California who took to ranch life with surprising ease. The twins married brothers from a neighboring ranch in a double wedding that was the social event of the season. Daniel went east to university, but came back with a degree in agriculture and new ideas about scientific farming. Lily swore she would never marry, then fell head over heels for a young lawyer from Carson City and married him before her 20th birthday. Through it all, Preston and Josephine stood together. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, cattle diseases and market crashes, the endless challenges of ranch life. They argued sometimes, fierce debates over decisions large and small, but they always came back to the fundamental respect that had been the foundation of their marriage from the beginning. On their 25th anniversary, their children threw them a party that half the territory attended. James Douglas, now elderly but still sharp, stood to give a toast. "25 years ago," he said, "Preston Quinn came to me and asked for time off to marry a woman he barely knew. I thought he was insane. But Preston told me he saw something in Josephine Summers that was worth betting his future on. He was right. Together they built not just a successful ranch but a legacy. They proved that partnership based on mutual respect can be stronger than any other foundation. They have been an example to all of us." He raised his glass. To Preston and Josephine Quinn, may they have 25 more years together, and may they be half as stubborn as the last 25. Everyone laughed and drank, and Josephine felt Preston's hand find hers under the table. She squeezed back, a silent conversation passing between them. "We did it," the touch said. "Against all odds, we built something beautiful." The years continued their march. Grandchildren arrived, filling the ranch with noise and laughter. Preston's hair went completely white, though he remained strong and vital well into his 60s. Josephine moved more slowly, her joints stiffening with age, but her mind remained sharp and her will unbroken. They handed over more and more responsibility to Samuel, who had his father's gift for managing people and his mother's head for business. But they remained involved, offering advice when asked, staying active in the daily operation of the ranch that was their life's work. One evening in late summer, when Josephine was 65 and Preston 68, they sat together on the porch watching the sun set over the land they had fought so hard to keep. Preston had his arm around her shoulders, her head resting on his chest, their bodies fitted together in the way of long practice. "You remember the day we met?" Josephine asked. "When I was standing outside the land office ready to fight the world." "I remember thinking you were the most magnificent thing I had ever seen," Preston said. "All that fire and pride and determination. I wanted to help you. More than that, I wanted to be near you." "I was so angry when you offered me money," she recalled. "My pride was all I had left, and you were trying to take even that. I learned quickly that your pride was not something to take, it was something to respect." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You taught me that, Josephine. You taught me that strength does not mean crushing someone else's spirit. It means standing beside them and helping them be strong too." "We were good teachers for each other," she said. "You taught me that accepting help does not make me weak. That partnership can be stronger than independence." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the sky orange and gold. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. Closer by, their grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. The ranch spread out before them, prosperous and thriving, a testament to 47 years of love and labor. "I would not change a single thing," Josephine said softly. "Not the struggle, not the fear, not even Frank Carlson and his attempts to destroy us. It all led here to this moment. To this life we built together." "Neither would I," Preston agreed. "Though I confess I am grateful the hard parts are behind us now," she laughed. "Are they? I suspect ranching always finds new ways to be difficult. True. But we will face them together as we always have." As darkness fell, they went inside to the house they had shared for nearly 5 decades. The next morning, they would rise early and begin another day of work. There would be cattle to check and accounts to review and grandchildren to spoil. There would be the endless demands of ranch life and the quiet satisfaction of work well done. But tonight, they simply held each other in the bed they had shared through so many seasons, grateful for the impossible bargain that had brought them together and the love that had grown from such practical beginnings. Preston Quinn had offered his name and his future to a woman too proud to beg, and she had accepted because she had no other choice. But what had begun as necessity had transformed into something neither of them could have imagined. They had built a partnership based on respect, grown it into love, and nurtured it into a legacy that would last generations. It was not the fairy tale romance of storybooks, with grand gestures and flowery declarations. It was something better. A love forged in adversity and strengthened by time, a partnership that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger for the testing. It was real and complicated and messy and perfect. It was theirs. And as Josephine drifted to sleep in her husband's arms, She thought about that day 47 years ago when she had stood outside the land office, too proud to beg but desperate enough to consider the impossible offer of a man she barely knew. She had thought she was saving her ranch, preserving her father's legacy. She had not known she was also saving herself, opening the door to a future richer than anything she could have imagined. Years continued to pass in comfortable rhythm. By the time Preston was 73 and Josephine 70, they had largely retired from active ranch management, though they remained fixtures on the Triple S. Samuel ran the operation with competence and confidence, consulting them on major decisions more out of respect than necessity. Their other children had built their own lives but remained close, gathering for holidays and celebrations with spouses and children, and eventually grandchildren in tow. The ranch had grown far beyond what Josephine's father had built. Through careful expansion and wise investment, the Triple S now covered over 5,000 acres and supported 300 head of cattle. The brand was known throughout Nevada and into California, synonymous with quality. Several of the hands who worked the ranch were second generation, sons of men who had worked for Preston and Josephine in the early years. Preston's health began to decline in his 74th year. Nothing dramatic, just a gradual slowing, a tiredness that rest did not cure. The doctor in Elko diagnosed a weak heart and prescribed rest and relaxation, orders that Preston cheerfully ignored whenever Josephine's attention wandered. She caught him in the barn one afternoon, grooming a horse despite strict instructions to avoid exertion. "Preston Quinn, you are the most stubborn man I have ever met," she scolded, though her voice was gentle. "Learned from the best," he replied with a smile that showed he knew exactly what he was doing. "Besides, a man needs purpose. I cannot just sit on the porch waiting to die." "No one is asking you to wait to die. I am asking you to be sensible so we have more years together." He set down the brush and took her hands in his. His grip was not as strong as it once was, but it was still steady. "Josephine, I have had a better life than I ever dreamed possible. Whatever time we have left, I want to spend it living, not hiding from death." She understood because she would have said the same thing in his position, so she stopped hovering quite so much and let him have his dignity. They spent their days doing the small tasks that kept them feeling useful, him maintaining the barn and her tending her garden. In the evenings they sat together on the porch, holding hands and watching the sun set, remembering everything they had built and everyone they had loved. On a warm June evening when Preston was 75, he did not come in for supper. Josephine found him in the barn, sitting on a hay bale with a peaceful expression on his face. He had simply stopped, his heart finally giving out in the place he loved best, surrounded by the horses and the smell of hay and the land that had been his home. The grief was a physical thing, crushing and overwhelming. For nearly 5 decades, Preston had been her partner, her love, her best friend. She had built her entire adult life around his presence. The hole he left was enormous and unbearable, but Josephine was not a woman who gave up, not even in the face of overwhelming sorrow. She mourned him deeply and honestly, supported by their children and grandchildren and the community they had helped build. She spoke at his funeral with a steady voice, telling stories that made people laugh and cry. She buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, where he could watch over the land forever. And then she kept living, because that was what Preston would have wanted. She was 72 years old and alone for the first time since she was 22, but she still had purpose. The ranch needed her wisdom, even if her body was too frail for the physical work. Her grandchildren and great-grandchildren needed her stories, the living connection to the history of the Triple S. She had life left to live, and she would not waste it. Samuel worried about her rattling around the big house alone, but Josephine refused to move in with any of her children. This was her home, full of memories of Preston. She could feel him in every room, hear his laugh echoing from the rafters. To leave would be to abandon part of him, and she was not ready for that. She lived another 8 years after Preston's death, remaining sharp and engaged until nearly the end. She saw her great-grandchildren grow, watched the Triple S continue to thrive under the 4th generation of her family. She gave advice when asked and meddled only occasionally, trusting that she and Preston had taught their children well. On a spring morning just after her 80th birthday, Josephine did not wake up. She had gone to sleep in the bed she had shared with Preston for 47 years and simply slipped away, her heart finally ready to rest. Her children found her looking peaceful, a slight smile on her face, one hand stretched out to the space where Preston used to sleep as if she had been reaching for him one last time. They buried her beside Preston on the hill, 2 headstones standing together overlooking the ranch they had saved and built and loved. The entire territory came to her funeral, ranchers and merchants and cowboys and ladies, all with stories about how Josephine Quinn had helped them, or inspired them, or simply shown them what was possible with determination and courage. Samuel stood on the porch of the main house after the funeral, surrounded by his siblings and their families. 4 generations of Quinns, all of them beneficiaries of the bargain his parents had struck so many years ago. "They did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They saved the ranch and built something that will last, something worth fighting for." "They did more than that," his sister Mary said. "They proved that 2 stubborn people who respect each other can build something beautiful. They showed us what love really looks like, not the easy kind but the kind you choose every day through work and compromise and faith." It was the perfect eulogy for a love story that had started with practical bargaining and grown into something legendary. Preston and Josephine Quinn had not had a fairy tale romance. They had built something better, a partnership that had transformed 2 individuals into something greater than the sum of their parts. The Triple S continued to prosper long after their deaths, passed down through generations of Quinns who all knew the story of how it had been saved. Josephine's great-great-grandchildren would sit on that same porch, watching the sun set over the same land, and hear the tale of the proud woman who could not beg and the cowboy who had offered his name and his future instead. It became a legend in the territory, the story of the Quinns and their impossible bargain. But those who had known them understood that the real miracle was not how it started, but how it endured. 2 people who had married for practical reasons had found something that transcended practicality. They had found respect and partnership and eventually love, the deep and abiding kind that shapes destinies and builds legacies. Their graves stood together on the hill for generations, 2 stones side by side, marking the resting place of Preston Quinn and Josephine Quinn. The inscriptions were simple, his listing his birth and death dates and the words "a man who kept his promises." Hers listing her dates and the words "a woman who never surrendered." But those who knew their story understood that the real inscription should have read, "Here lie 2 people who found each other when they needed it most, built something beautiful from practical beginnings, and proved that the strongest foundation for love is respect." The Triple S Ranch continued to operate well into the 20th century and beyond, a lasting testament to what 2 stubborn people could accomplish when they refused to give up. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blew just right across the Nevada rangeland, old-timers would swear you could hear 2 voices on the breeze, still arguing amiably about cattle and land and life, still choosing each other day after day, still building something beautiful together, even after death. It was not the romantic beginning that stories usually celebrated, but it was a perfect ending. Two lives intertwined so completely that even death could not fully separate them. Two legacies merged into one. Two people who had offered each other everything when it mattered most, and had spent a lifetime making that initial bargain into something sacred. Preston had offered his name and his future to a woman too proud to beg, and she had accepted because she had no choice. But what had started as desperation and practicality had transformed, through years of shared labor and mutual respect and growing affection, into one of the great love stories of the Nevada territory. They had built not just a successful ranch but a family, not just a partnership but a love that would echo through generations. And in the end, that was the real triumph. Not that they had saved the Triple S, though they had. Not that they had built a prosperous operation, though they had done that too. The real triumph was that two people who had married for all the wrong reasons had somehow found all the right ones along the way, proving that love based on respect and partnership could be just as powerful, just as enduring as any romance born from passion alone. Their story became part of the land itself, inseparable from the Triple S, told and retold until it achieved the status of legend. And the lesson at the heart of it remained relevant through all the years. That sometimes the greatest love stories start not with attraction or desire, but with two people brave enough to take a chance on each other. Two people willing to build something together even when the foundation seems impossibly shaky. Preston and Josephine Quinn had done exactly that. They had taken a bargain born of desperation and transformed it through sheer stubborn dedication into a love that lasted a lifetime and a legacy that lasted generations. They had proved that sometimes the best marriages are not the ones that start with fireworks, but the ones built slowly and carefully through shared purpose and mutual respect. And on the Triple S Ranch, their great-great-great-grandchildren still worked the land, still raised cattle, still told the story of how it all began, with a proud woman who would not beg and a good man who offered everything without being asked. It was a story worth remembering, worth passing down, worth celebrating. It was a story about love, but not the easy kind. It was about the love that weathers storms and survives hardship. The love that chooses to stay when leaving would be simpler. The love that builds and nurtures and endures. The love that starts with respect and grows into something that changes not just two lives but countless generations. Preston and Josephine Quinn's love story. Improbable and practical and absolutely perfect in every way that mattered.